give me just like probably a minute. What do we think for the food and all? You was criminal?
No, I'm driving myself.
You're welcome. Just gonna ask Lauren if you can see us.
There was a gentleman that came in from SAP for Germany, and Helen Oakley was SAP started.
No way.
They have it in Sabina. It's LCL, Leading Science.
She's not there.
No, yeah, I'm
She had some cybersecurity for Microsoft and Johnson and Johnson. And last night, the lady from the voice spoke about all of this very dry law on the legislation around privacy issues. Like, for example, when we're in a company, like Microsoft or Facebook, and I told her 1,000 customers' data, I'd be finding thousands, 7,900, 7,500, each one of them. I thought that was people on Facebook pretty dry. She's a lawyer. She's quite nice. Still interested. The presentation from the SAP was held in Baltimore, New Jersey, and they talked about all this gender diversity and how sensitive it is. By the way, I learned a lot last night because there's so much to know about diversity. That's really helpful.
So don't blame me. You should take it along.
Binary and trans and all these things. Like we didn't grow up with. We didn't even like to use it. We didn't have it like my niece. But back then, we didn't get so much about it. How gender diversity is. And then I felt like I was learning it almost for the first time last night about binary.
no, it can't.
I'm just down the street. No, not here.
All right, everybody in the back, if we could just grab whatever last couple of items you need from the table. We're about to get started in 2 minutes. We're gonna outgrow it by August.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's we've been hiring people like Ambuses in Toronto, and fact, in the first quarter of 2019, we hired 32 people full-time across Canada. Yeah, and we already have like I think 22 people already placed for Q2 so far, and so we're well beyond track. So we're really excited about that.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy with it. But you've been to our office in Kitchener many times.
Yes.
Yeah.
Launch. Technically.
Remember that? That was like 1 year ago.
Was it really?
May the 4th. Right?
May the fourth be with you.
Yeah, we've come a long way in a year's time.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So we lost Canada, how many?
I feel like a real company now.
Silicon Valley style.
I'm pretty sure we're live right now, so I think we can get going. All right, Bogdan, are you good? All right. Want to grab a seat? All right. Alrighty. Welcome, everybody. My name is Nabil Fahel. I'm Director of Partnerships here at Terminal. It's a real pleasure to have you guys join us at Terminal Toronto. And I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our speakers today. So first of all, Carl and Ben, thank you for joining us today. We could just give them a round of applause. Just before we get started, if you're unfamiliar with Terminal, our goal is to push the world forward by bringing global opportunities to talent. If you want to learn more about that or the job opportunities we have here, you could just visit terminal.io or speak to myself, Amanda, Zorn, or anybody else on the team here after the talk. With that said, I would like to turn the attention to the speakers. So Ben is the CIO of the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. He was hired as the inaugural CIO of the Institute to undergo a significant expansion and digital transformation for the Institute. The Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics is now the world's largest private institute for theoretical physics research. And prior to that, Ben has over 25 years of managed IT and IT operations experience in North America, Asia, Europe. And he started his career as a software developer, effectively building systems for socioeconomic impact analysis as well as market research. And then he went on to co-found a startup as well as work at various other startups early on in his career. And so we're really lucky to have Ben join us here today. He has experience in sectors that include software, transportation,
Theoretical physics.
Theoretical physics. And yeah. And so, and Ben's, he lives and works today in Waterloo region. So thank you for joining us today, Ben.
My pleasure.
And beside Ben, we have Carl, who's the CIO of Legal Aid Ontario. And Carl is an entrepreneurial CIO with decades of experience leading digital transformation across many different industries. He's underseen the kind of IT infrastructure for Legal Aid Ontario for many years, and he also has experience thinking and putting in the systems in place to think about how future and emerging technologies are going to affect his practice and his team's practice. Things like even blockchain, artificial intelligence, and machine learning are some of the things that they're presently experimenting with and laying the foundation to bring Legal Aid Ontario into the modern era. And so we're really, really honored to have Carl join us here today as well. So please, once again, big round of applause for the speakers. From time to time, I'm just going to consult my notes on my phone. I'm not, so I'm just going to pull up some of the questions. But I guess the first thing that we could start with, in your own words, can you please describe the role of a CIO? And maybe we could start with Ben and move over to Carl.
Sure. So I think, by way of context, one of my favorite definitions of technology is that quip that technology is everything that doesn't work yet. And by that definition, the CIO is responsible for all the broken bits. So that's one, I think, very useful thing that might resonate with you, Carl. The other, really the aspect of being a CIO today that's important is that it's a constant juggle between the boundless opportunities we have with all the technology and really the fast pace of change in technology with the concomitant risks that we're seeing rise in security and privacy. And so it's a very interesting time and an interesting sector to be working. I assume most of you are in the same business, and so you'll realize that there is a constant juggle here and there's a lot of pressure. And I think that's a good description of where we're at.
Yeah, and to your point, it's usually when things break, that's when people come to us. When things are working, they don't want to see us, right? But I think with the CIO's role in terms of industry, you look at an organization as like a plane, and in the middle is a fulcrum, and you have that balance. And literally with the CIO, you want to make sure that the organization is moving ahead strategically on what's important, but at the same time, you got to save the organization from stuff such as security risks. But you want to make sure that you're innovating. You want to make sure that the data, folks, in terms of your data, is solid. And the other part is you're always dealing with crisis in terms of making sure that you're responsive. In this industry, I always learned over the years, and a lot of yourselves probably can relate, IT sometimes could be a thankless profession because you've done so much work. You got your MVP, you got your code, you got your everything moving forward, and a crisis happens, you have to refactor. So I sort of call it like the 911 emergency room effect. Some days you go in, it's fires, but some days it's very smooth and rewarding.
Maybe I'd add one more thing that I should mention too is that there are traditional definitions of the CIO role, and it's worth commenting that, which is that the CIO was typically the inward-facing responsible IT leader. So we were responsible for systems and infrastructure that really drive business operations. And that's in contrast to the CTO, which was usually responsible for technical product, outward-facing technologies. Now, the reason why we're talking about the future of enterprise today is these lines are all blurring. And I see people nodding their heads now. So if you consider, for example, the pressures today and the focus on, say, customer journeys and how there are multiple touch points of a customer throughout the process from becoming aware of an organization to engaging with them to onboarding to support, there's no longer a simple process where the CTO's product is what the customer sees. So these lines are blurring. And not only that, now we have this plethora of new roles that's really crowding the C-suite. So we have chief digital officers, chief data officers, chief experience officers. And so there are a lot of justifiable questions about who's in charge of what and where this is. For that a little bit today.
Yeah, and on that point, I mean, what technologies or IT trends do you think will have the biggest impact on your organization in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so with regards to our organization, the past 5 years, our strategy 5 years ago was around ensuring that our systems were secure, highly available, keeping them current, that is making sure they're upgraded. And the other part was really enabling efficient and effective technology. One of the things we're seeing is, it's, as Ben's mentioning, it's one thing in terms of the digitization around the customer journey is one thing, but we know that right now with all the advances in machine learning, including artificial intelligence, depending on what approach you're taking, and including how you can look at applications that will exist with your ERPs, but they'll be very tactical. So change is happening there, and we're seeing that, and that's one of the things I think we got to be ready for. If not, we got to start to dabble, start to learn, explore on those things.
So that's intriguing and very similar to where we're positioned. My own story at the Perimeter Institute was that coming on as a new CIO there, it was an institute that was growing very quickly. We were doubling the size of the institute, and it had a lot of proprietary technology. And so the cloud became a very significant part of our strategy, and it has really panned out very well for us. We are now, 9 years later, fully cloud-first organization, and it's allowed us to scale dramatically. to really refocus our skill sets internally to more service front office focused skills. But it comes with its own set of risks and challenges, and we'll talk more about those. So I think for us, cloud has been a huge part of our strategy to date. It's really made us nimble and has allowed us to focus on tangible services that the organization recognizes and values. That being said, we're faced with a whole new set of challenges, especially the growing issues around security and privacy. And if you're watching the news, you're seeing, for example, the recent Equifax case, changes to PIPEDA, all these new laws that are coming out that aren't actually well defined. They're going to be fought out in the courts over years to come. That's keeping us very much on our toes. So in terms of technology trends, CIOs are increasingly faced with becoming quasi-legal experts, understanding the liabilities we have. I don't know if that resonates with you. Here's the guy from the law organization. So that's becoming an increasing challenge for us. So I would say just sort of security is huge now, really taking up a lot of time for all of us. Cloud is massive, and then AI is coming on very strong, and hopefully we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, and for you, Carl, like what does cloud mean for your industry, and how is that shaping what's happening?
Yeah. So as Ben indicated, cloud is very strategic. We do have cloud services that we're using. A lot of the workloads traditionally, when you're on-prem, the issue we've seen is basically how do you keep them updated. At the same time, sometimes you need to have custom on-premise workloads. The whole part of cloud, as Ben mentioned, around security, that's so critical. And one of the things is that the benefit of cloud is that you know your apps, depending on what your workload is, you're able to actually keep them in the cloud secured. In terms of us, one of the concerns that we have is data residency. So for our purpose, we have to have strict guidelines on acquisitions, which requires us to have our data in Canada and Canadian data centers. So with that, security is one of the things where you have to look at it, again, almost like a measurement where you'd say, okay, based on acquiring a cloud system, does the vendor have all these certifications? Some certifications that are important, and again, I'm sure you're aware of them, but ISO 27001 or SOC 1 and 2 compliance, these are required because as IT in the past, when we do our own testing, we would show the auditors to say, okay, based on our testing, here's all the results. But when you're in the cloud, you need to make sure who's actually operating that data center. If there's any sub-processing happening, where's that sub-processing? And the other challenge is that now with machine learning, for example, some vendors out there have data lakes where they'll say, we can do NLP oriented programming, provide you all the greatest text search automations, but the secret sauce to them is they're sharing the metadata in their data lake to provide their service. So there's a lot of nuances, things that you got to look at, and that's where security, I think, is the number one thing that will always continue to be something important around the cloud.
Yeah, and these days you have some companies who can handle that security piece a little bit better than some organizations can themselves, right? One of the examples I think about is, in Canada we have the e-commerce behemoth, right, in Shopify, and what they've done to really transform that industry with their SaaS offering and whatnot.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the benefits of cloud is that if you're a smaller or mid-sized organization, you can move to compliance very quickly if you're in the cloud and you choose the right providers. There are risks, as Carl is pointing out, and you need to know a lot, but you can achieve a high level of compliance by outsourcing that function. And that's a bit paradoxical because typically there's a lot of resistance to going to the cloud amongst your executive suite and just generally that you're giving up control. This is getting out into the public space. The reality is these big organizations are much more vulnerable than many individual organizations, and so they take security pretty seriously. Shopify is a good example of that.
Totally. Well, as you and I were talking prior to the talk, you were telling me about your term cognitive automation, right? And so you joked about how it might be a fancy term for AI, but cognitive automation doesn't sound as intelligent as artificial intelligence. But in any case, we have a number of artificial intelligence companies here that we house. So in your words, with your organization, how is AI going to impact your organization in the near term? Can you give us like some concrete examples of how that's happening maybe today and how that's happening in the near term for your organizations, please.
Yeah, so for us, it was interesting to see how this suddenly became a thing. It was not through strategy, but really through our researchers. So we're a research organization, but it's really our physicists who've really reached out and started using AI as an instrumental part of the research. Now, it's a subset of what we do in terms of theoretical physics, but there are people out there who are now starting to use machine learning, for example, in very interesting ways. So they're using AI to really to help the research they're doing in quantum mechanics, quantum information. They're also using some of the techniques in those fields to move the dial forward in terms of AI. So, so this has really come from the surface up. And if you think about research, you don't always think about research as an area that's rife for AI. But actually, with all the iterative research and hypothesis testing that you need to do, machine learning and AI offer some really interesting opportunities, and this is taking off in other sectors quite quickly, like pharmaceuticals. So for us, it's coming on the research side, and then indirectly, of course, it's coming through all of the many SaaS systems we use, which are acquiring AI firms, left, right, and center.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and with AI, years ago when Google started to do their ImageNet testing and dabbling with different applications, connecting an iOS app I built to APIs that I downloaded from GitHub, and the innovation, in my view, started like years ago. But now what we're seeing literally in the marketplace is there are vendors out there that are saying, they have products, and these are machine learning AI products. We know with the big vendors, to the point of, with the bigger vendors of the world, don't really want to name names because I think, like to sort of say big vendors, but they're solving these issues, and they're saying they can provide the security, the APIs, the cloud. That's strategic for us. But one of the things I think is important is, as Ben has said, and I went on a tour of Perimeter Institute, including some of the AI experts down in Waterloo last fall, and one of the things I think that's really fundamental is there's so many proofs happening in terms of how AI is going to be able to enable so many different things. We know with images, as basic as is a cat or a dog, but with our lawyers, one of the key things is our lawyers are even talking to me about stuff, asking to say, how can we do things better, different, more efficiently? So again, not to say that AI is going to replace lawyers, it won't. But we see AI strategically assistive in terms of a technology. And one of the things on that point is there's the human part of it, but there's the ability to accelerate knowledge and provide it. And same with people who consume information. One of the things that we're seeing is the ability to take information and you can structure it and you can place it out there, have people interact, bring it back, and use ML to recalibrate what you want to provide back. So it is a great opportunity window. I think that's going to continue. But the other part is really the risk side of it and making sure that in managing it and doing it, there's no unfortunate consequences where you didn't really understand around the privacy, the security, and those type of considerations.
And on the AI point, do you worry about potentially like AI gone awry, like a la Elon Musk, if you will, like the downside of what AI could turn into from a societal perspective? Is that something that you've given any thought to?
Well, personally, I'm an AI optimist.
Okay.
But I realize that's an optimistic view. Sure, there are lots of inherent problems, but I think ultimately it's going to be a huge game changer, and you really have to just embrace it. We're not seeing this in the next 5 years as a big game changer in our organization, but it's certainly something we're tracking very closely. I don't know if you've found that.
Yeah, I'm an AI optimist as well.
Yeah.
One of the things I do think is fundamental is being able to prove your proofs. So one of the things I always look at is really, for example, we did a research project through Ryerson University, and with the students, we were really explaining two models. We said, how can we use AI, ML to advance services, but how can we keep integrity on the transactions, which is blockchain. So again, how do these work together? The whole part would be to make sure whatever you're doing, you can audit. And the other part is if your bias is changing, then have the required algorithms and constructs to sort of notify you. I sort of see it almost like you're driving on the road, and not that you can take your hands off the wheel, but cars literally, they're pretty good now. They drive really well. but at the same time, if something happens, I sort of see AI as being assistive. Someone's driving, they have a cardiac arrest. I think that car and that owner has the benefit of the fact that the car can actually do something. So the whole part of AI is really looking at it the other way. That is, it's something to look to help to sort of address the risks in society, but at the same time be aware of how to do it so that you don't have, again, these unfortunate consequences.
If you had an unlimited budget, what, in your opinion, is like the coolest new tech that you would have your team play around with? I'll start with Ben.
So I'm gonna come up with something that I saw very recently, and I don't think the organization would necessarily support this. They'd love the end result. I recently did a tour of Mayer Sound Labs in California, and they do some very high-end audio engineering. And this is an issue. You might be surprised at how much time this takes up for someone like myself and my organization, but bad architecture and bad acoustics are the bane of a lot of IT help desks. So we continually deal with, we've got a fabulous building with great design, but we're constantly struggling with some architectural issues in our meeting rooms. And it's all got to do with acoustics ultimately. And we also have a restaurant that is the heart of our institute that people like to spend the day in when they can and just chat. And again, the acoustics aren't great. Now what Mayer does that's really fascinating is they've developed a system called Constellation. And the best way to experience this is you go into a busy restaurant, which I did, and you sit at a table and you realize you're having an easy conversation with the 4 people around you, although it's a full busy restaurant with music playing and all these conversations. And then you stand up from your table and you start realizing that there's all sorts of noise around you that you weren't aware of. And so what they're doing is they're using an array of microphones and speakers in their installations, and they basically obscure the sounds around you. So they're turning it into white noise. And it was almost as if they had scripted this evening, because in going to that restaurant, there was a table behind me of septuagenarians who had called the waiter over, and they're saying, "What is going on in here? We've never been able to talk like this in a restaurant and enjoy ourselves." So something like that, it's out there. It's not mainstream technology you'd find in an enterprise, but something like that could completely change, for example, the experience you'd have sitting in a restaurant in our facility and trying to have good conversations about physics and about research, which is what we do all day long. So that's kind of a neat new technology you wouldn't think of normally. It's not AI, but there we go.
That's excellent. I know in the office, especially open space, a lot of times you have people around you and you're like, oh gosh, I put in my earbuds so I'm not distracted, so that'd be awesome. The question's loaded because I think sometimes, there's so many things that can happen in terms of technology. The one thing I would always say, I'm an optimist with AI, because I'm always an optimist that I think, we can look at AI or any technology changing the world for the better, right? So number one thing I would say would be finding a way to really look at AI, including the advances through quantum computing and all that, to find cures, find cures to illness. Again, I sort of call it the preventative model. That is, look at the data sets we have and start to really look at AIs as being, powerful enough to really take data sets, help society. Through that, right, you can reapply these concepts. So I sort of see it as really, I'd love to see in terms of healthcare, something out there that would really show and demonstrate for the benefit. So that would be my...
Yeah, and that's something like Yuval Noah Harari talks about in *Sapiens* and in advancement. Yeah, cool. All right, well,
maybe I can. I'll throw another piece on there, because since we do keep coming back to AI,
cool.
I would say, since a couple people asked me about perimeter, that it does seem to be a bit of a golden age right now in physics, and that may be a debatable point, but there are a lot of large international experiments now that are starting to really show some really interesting results. The latest one you may have heard of just last week was the Event Horizon Telescope, where they've got the first image of a black hole. Perimeter was the only Canadian team involved in that international collaboration. But what all of these experiments have in common, just like CERN and like LIGO in the US and CHIME, which you'll be hearing more about in the near future, they all are producing massive amounts of data. And so that's challenging certainly how we do our research and the need to be able to deal with large computational data sets. And so, unlimited budget, of course, it would be a heck of a lot more AI researchers and staff to help look at new ways of doing this. I mean, theoretical physics has been fairly traditional in its approach to now. It's a lot of math. I actually have in my group, in the IT group, a research technology group, and there are a couple of physicists right now. And what they do is they act as a liaison between the technology world and the physics world. So they're there to catalyze the kind of research we're doing. So we have a computational physicist, and then we have a data scientist, and the data scientist is the newer acquisition. And I would say, that's going to be a bottleneck going forward for all of us. I think it's going to be increasingly hard to find these resources. And it's not just the data scientists now, it's the decision scientists and the other skills you need to build AI solutions and to actually use them in a useful way. So that's going to be, I think, a significant challenge going forward, and it'll be harder and harder to get these people because they're all being scooped up by the big 4 or 5 vendors too.
Right. Yeah, for anybody is everybody familiar with like the M87 black hole photo discovery? Yeah, it's
The news work.
It was pretty remarkable to have, there was cameras positioned on different corners of the Earth. It was a small miracle to have the weather cooperate so that it would be clear enough, and the photo of the black hole. Like, this is a black hole that's, I was just reading on your website, it's 55 million light years away. And it's right at the heart of the Virgo constellation. And it's a good thing that it's that far away, because every single day it eats up, like, effectively the mass of 90 Earths. So it's just staggering. And if you guys are interested in a really cool poster, you could just Google Perimeter Institute black hole poster, and the team there has assembled a really great graphic that you're welcome to download, along with all kinds of other posters that you guys put out on a regular basis. I don't know, I'm a bit of a science nerd, so yeah, I spent quite a bit of time reading about that. And interestingly, you were in California at Google Cloud CX while I was at your office when they were having a panel.
He doesn't stop bothering me about this. Missing the single biggest announcement of the last decade.
Fair enough. Anyways, we have a question from the live stream, and we're happy to take questions from the audience as well if you guys are on deck. So for a young person emerging in their career, what are the qualities that a good CIO of the future should be focusing on developing earlier in their career?
Start?
Sure. I would say basically being kind, having an open mind, knowing your stuff in terms of your background, depending what you specialize in. If you're on the data, if you're on the application, it's so important to really pick an area that you have, but understand all the layers. Because in terms of how technology works, it's all the pieces together that really make the solution. Another part of that would be to not be afraid to dabble. That is, you're doing projects, jumping into different innovation projects. Ideas, innovation comes through community and meeting with people. So doing a lot of meetups and that. The other thing I can reflect on is that in my career is not being afraid to look at other people, whether it's someone you work with, someone you know from school, or even someone in your network to have a coffee. A lot of things I've learned in my career have been because I've asked really tough questions to people. And one example I'd like to give, and just as just a side story, is actually when I got hired at Legal Aid, our CIO at the time, I was the app dev manager. Again, passion for me was developing apps and designing systems. But our CIO asked me to go to a conference at the convention center, and basically it was with Microsoft, and it happened to be with executives. In the front row, it was a close forum, and Bill Gates was there speaking. So as we're sitting there, I was like, I was definitely a geek in terms of, loved applications. I loved OpenStack a lot, and I thought it'd be an interesting question in the Q&A if I asked him about OpenStack and what's Microsoft's strategy. So I was sitting there, and then my friend, CIO at the time, I showed him the question. He goes, "You can't ask Bill that question." I go, "No." I go, "It's an important question. I'd like to get his perspective." So the bottom line is, the question I had asked was, with the speed of innovation moving, with the speed of innovation moving at the speed of fiber, like in terms of how things are evolving, how does Microsoft plan to keep its research and development costs down, but at the same time really allow for innovation to happen? Because I love open source. And he stopped, and literally he went on for 7 minutes to explain everything about Microsoft, from when he started it, and he went fast forward into the future. And one of the things he said, which I thought was really important and pivotal, was he said that years from now, a lot of organizations are always going to say to themselves, are you secure? And trust is really critical for how you build systems. And that's something that anchored as to how I've managed my career. And that's why, in terms of, like my comment is, never be afraid to ask the tough questions. Never be afraid to meet people, because in terms of human nature, people want to give, they want to share. And the other part is have a good story in terms of what you're trying to do. The 7-second elevator pitch is so critical to make that connection. And I can explain many, many times where I've done that, but I don't have enough time on this panel to do that. But if you ever want some advice, I'm on LinkedIn, more than glad to share that. And the other part is...
Which year was the meeting?
I have the transcript for my kids back then because I kept it. It was a
Because
live web.
That's relevant.
Yes,
the
live.
story.
Yeah, live webcast. Absolutely, it was 2004 probably, right? And that at the time then when XP was the big thing, and the future was still unfolding. But the other part is with Ben, right? So I met Ben through an invitation, and getting out last fall to Perimeter for me, it was incredible. I met Roger Melko in terms of the CDL lab. I happened to, through that meeting, when I came back to our organization, I thought, you know what, I'm going to sponsor a Ryerson ML project, because just getting out there, right? So again, my experience this year with Ben was really just getting out there and learning, and that sort of helped to spawn what I was doing. So that's my advice to those young entrepreneurs, in terms of whatever industry you're in and whatever your goal would be. Happen to be CIO, great, but for anything.
Fair enough.
So let me add on a few
Yeah,
points
sure.
there. I also want to say that it's any senior leadership position is a people person. It's a people position. There's a lot of management skills, all the same usual bag. I would say that you can come at this from either side. You can come at this from the liberal arts, or you can come at it from a scientific or engineering background. So I'm a liberal arts grad. I was an economics major. I didn't pursue that. Went right into programming and then up through that route. But I wouldn't get caught up in stereotypical paths or journeys to get here. A lot of the CIOs I knew when I was younger often came out of infrastructure backgrounds, and that is going to change dramatically. So I think, if you're asking specifically about how to become a CIO in the future, you're going to come out of a technical field, or you're going to come at it from a project management background. And that is purely because these are positions that deal with people a lot and understand that, you have to know how to balance requirements. You can't get too technically zealous about your architectures or your plans. You have to know how to work with people. You have to be a good salesman. And you have to be good at explaining complex topics to people who don't understand them, right? All your colleagues. So those are key skills.
Absolutely. Yeah. Question in the audience.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, how important it is for the CIO to also know the business, like the industry that he or she is in? For example, in
question.
theoretical
Yeah.
physics,
Yeah.
do you have to be a theoretical
So
physicist?
the question is, how important is it for the CIO to understand specifically the industry that they're in order to be very effective in the role?
So I'm going to be a bit of, I think, an iconoclast on that one. I think it's not that important. And that's an obstacle you'll confront every time you change industries. Every industry thinks that they're special, just like every company thinks they're special. And they always want deep industry expertise, and they look for that. I think 80 to 90% of what we do, though, is not industry specific. And you can port that from one organization to another. Not only that, after you've been working across sectors, and I've worked across quite a few in my career, you bring a much broader view of what can be done, and you're not mired in the traditional views of this is how we do things in industry X, Y, or Z. So that's certainly my perspective on it.
Do you want to weigh on that?
Yeah, I agree. In terms of a CIO's role, no matter what, you're going to get hired by your organization. You're going to have to learn regardless. Even if you were, I'm not a lawyer, but with lawyers, when I got hired, I learned how to build the systems as a developer, an app dev manager, because I had to learn the models. So the fact is, you spend your career learning, so you can learn a business model. So you learn the business model really well. But the other part is that, as Ben's saying, that is, then you're going to be more adaptive. That is, if you want to advance further in terms of getting into a CIO role, you're going to have to learn broader, right? And broader means you have to really understand how to sort of work with business plans, strategic plans. The number one thing is simplifying technical discussions so an executive could understand them. So all these things are very common traits, but I do think you have to have, you can get out in the field, you'll learn more, and that's one of the key things that I think is important. You got to be, internally, you know what your role is, but you got to be as well external, working with others to learn that. In some instances too, it may be a matter of fact, you happen to have, you're in the profession as a CIO, and perhaps you are a lawyer. That's a very strong role. But at the same time, my view is, and from what I'm seeing, you don't have to be from that background if you're in the role.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that to agree very much with this, the lack of technical background. Like if we only look at the examples in Silicon Valley, how many of those CEOs are really technologists or, and this is why they are serial entrepreneurs. They start 5 companies, which none of them have to do with what was before.
Absolutely right.
It was in the olden days, like it was the guy, was a bad example, but anyway, he was a basketball coach, right? And they all went to prison. What company was that? you know which one I'm talking.
There are a few. Yeah.
Do you have a question though for the panel?
No, I just wanted to say that this was, it's easy to figure that out, what you say, and I was bringing this example
Right.
to
No, that's a good
support
one. Yes.
your
Thank you.
position.
Fair
That's
enough.
all.
That's good.
That's better than example.
Yeah, fair enough. Before I go back to the live stream audience, is there any other questions in the crowd? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, so you both mentioned you were AI optimists, and one great thing of all this AI and machine learning that has come out is increased capability, but that is often accompanied with reduced interpretability and explainability because they're black box everywhere. Often then occurs is bias, and I see this is more of a problem for legal aid than Perimeter Institute. I mean, the classic AI bias example is recidivism for parolees, that when you're trying to predict who should get parole or not, invariably what happens with these more accurate AI systems is you introduce bias, like racial bias, socioeconomic bias. So what is legal aid? What are you doing to ensure that if these tools are used, that we don't unfairly discriminate against communities?
So the question is, how do you address the almost inevitability of potential bias creeping into whatever systems or models of AI are implemented?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's a very important question. In that, one of the key things that I heard about in industry is that when you look at AI, especially, let's say, to your point of, we don't do any type of stuff where we're sentencing, but let's say in the United States, for example, AIs are being used for certain things. My view is that what we're doing is in terms of providing a service to make sure that we can represent and support someone to the best outcome. So as I mentioned earlier, what I sort of see for AI is it's an assistive tool. There's a human, that's a lawyer, someone who's professional. They're under a very specific obligation to do the best they can. So they're using it as an assistant. An example would be, I'll give a very basic, simple use case, is it could be as simple as document preparation. That is, in order to actually get the support and service for that person who needs representation, using NLP is an easier way to actually prepare and coalesce and get information ready. But my view on that is, to your point, is we got to be very careful for unfortunate consequences, where we assume with black box type approach. The other thing is that in industry right now, one of the really important parts that I'm very passionate about is the explainability factor with AI is critical. And as much as I'm passionate about what I think AI can bring, I'm very practical in terms of the auditing components. So for example, at a recent conference I was at, workshop, speaking with a data scientist, and she was explaining the whole part of you have to be able to have your inputs audited on your outputs. But even further than that, one of the theories I'm hoping, and in terms of industry to prove, for industry to prove, not for me to prove, because that's not what I'm doing, but I'm trying to find out how do you audit black boxes. So my view with blockchain is, I think with blockchain, from what I've learned, is blockchain provides immutability. So if you can look at a transaction set, and the model, very basic, would be you're building a system or an application, you want to use ML, but all your outputs, you got to have a way to log them, verify, including the results set. So I sort of see there has to be a way, ideally, if you can use black box for some type of use case, as you mentioned, the criticality, there should be some way to measure and then to be able to say, yes, if something did happen, you can go back to your algorithm, you can go back to the state, in terms of the state where the process was. And an example would be as we push out code in production, we use DevOps, to push stuff out, you automate, you got to roll back. An auditor will say to you, what happened here, you can prove. So I think with AI, you still have to prove, and that's what I would always want to think in terms of the design. So I hope that gave you some reassurance in terms of your question.
Another question from the audience?
I think you may have sort of gone around what I was thinking, so it's not in my head a lot. The quality of the data, especially when you have that volume, when you need volume, so you don't have those outliers. So how do you take care of the quality of the data and clean it or verify? You talk about auditing and checking.
So in the advent of big data, how do you ensure that your data set is clean?
So in my view with quality assurance, nothing changes in terms of the models around how you manage data. So you look at data as being, depending on the type of data you have. So one would be your classification of the data. So in terms of classifying the data, so right now, let's say if I have a case management system of which I have integrity checks on my data, then I know for a fact that I can see the format. I can see as well doing samplings. So one of the things that I would see in the model specific to AI would be, and I use this sort of abstract on it, but on occasion we do random audits, and these random audits are important because you still want to make sure that you're not discerning yourself away from the data where you're saying we trust it. So you always have to have the ability to do some auditing. And the other part that I see over and above the auditing is the proofs, and that's why I think with blockchain, my theory or my hunch is there's got to be some way, aside from a relational database, other databases, where you can have another layer. And I know with technology, for example, because I've seen it where you have a situation, you got to look through all the system to find out what happened. You have your app server logs, your web server logs, your database files, and you're piecing it all together. And I would see, hopefully, with ML and AI in that, there's got to be another log stream that has to exist in the architecture. And then the other part would be your auditing. So perhaps advanced automated auditing where you choose your samplings that they're going to run and stuff. So that's one idea.
I would add to that a far less technical view, which is that I'm an AI optimist. I'm not going to let my fridge order my milk anytime soon. But I do think that transparency, as the other gentleman had mentioned, is a huge issue that needs to be watched closely. And so does data cleansing, if you will. And my experience just over the last 20, 30 years is that this is not new to AI. In every major systems project I've been on, this is the chronically underfunded and underlooked issue that has a domino effect on projects. And that's not going to go away, and it's going to be exacerbated because people are going to want to throw large data sets, not recognizing the massive costs of making those data sets clean and useful. A good question.
Did we have another question over here?
Yeah, just a quick question. As enterprises move to a cloud-first strategy, do you feel the role of a CIO to govern coming under pressure from the business streams? As a follow-up, how do you explain the importance of IT governance, for example, to a CMO that's using Salesforce or some random SaaS application?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I think this really goes back to the nub of what was the presentation here, was what's the future of enterprise IT, right? So just getting back to that for a minute, if I had to pitch what my vision is for enterprise IT in the next 5 to 10 years, it's flatter and wider, right? And so I think, this is the point I really wanted to drive home today, which is that, the traditional IT stack, the technology stack, is being eaten from the bottom up, right? It's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. So a lot of traditional roles and responsibilities and activities is starting to evaporate. And it's, to a certain extent, being eaten by the top down, because a lot more people are getting involved in the design and delivery of technology, right? So that's the flattening of the IT operational model, if you will. The widening of that model is that technology is ubiquitous, right? The old notion of the IT silo is already disappeared. There was a survey recently that said something like 80% of hires across the business have significant technical requirements now. So, and there's a large move now to also align functional expertise with business knowledge to get delivery to the edge of the organization, right? So you want your business experts to be able to deliver incremental improvements to your customers and to your stakeholders. And that requires a fundamentally different model than what we have today. So what that means, you can kind of guess at where we're going, but IT is going to have to become a center of excellence as opposed to the owner of technology. I think there's a big, significant role there that can be overlooked. And so getting back to your point about the CMO, nowadays, with the accessibility of technology in the cloud, IT has complained forever about shadow IT. The reality is that's a good thing, not a bad thing. We have to embrace that. We have to create the models to embrace that properly. Because you want to empower people to go out and test and trial new things, but then you need to bring them back into the fold and make sure that you've got data governance and assurance and so on and so forth. So I do think, and in fact I am engaged in discussions exactly like that, where there is that push and pull. We want to run off and use the system and do this thing, and that's great, but then you also have to make sure that that works with a broader enterprise strategy. And that is why this is such a collaborative role, and it requires a lot of negotiation, a lot of salesmanship, and explaining. Hopefully that answered your question.
No, exactly. Please.
Yeah, if I can add, I agree with what Ben is saying. When you look at the cloud too, one of the key things I think that's very important is you need to have some policy at least. So one of the basics for our organization has been, just like Ben saying, everyone would love to have apps, and there's nothing wrong with that. Departments want to have different apps. The only thing is you still got to make sure you have some policy around how you're going to acquire, make sure secure. But the other part, sort of flip the discussion on cloud, is when you look at what's happening with data too. Right now the trend is a lot of organizations had heavy data on-prem, because when the cloud was coming out, you saw it strategically to get your apps out there, and you thought, well, your data, you're going to keep it on-prem. But now what's happening from, again, peers of mine in industry, data is now going to the cloud big time as well, not just the application services or SaaS in that infrastructure service, all these things. So with data now, data is actually sort of taking on another dimension where it is almost, at one time used to be sort of contained by the app, but now data is really the app itself. So that's a shift happening too. So on that note, the way things will continue, it seems like you may have centralized structures, you have cloud structures, and you have decentralized in terms of how I sort of been looking at with distributed applications, because you don't need to necessarily have everything in one spot. You can choose with different protocols to send all your apps out to wherever you want them to be in that. So.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So as both of you as AI optimists, do you think that AI can help people having more real life interaction and human being more human?
So as the question is, as AI optimists, what are your thoughts around AI helping have more human interactions?
That's a very philosophical question. So we would be weighing in things probably well outside of our expertise, but certainly having older parents, for example, who could use a lot more services than are available to them. I see there being a significant role in providing senior care, for example, care even within hospitals, where AI might be the first line of service, whether that's through, robot caretakers or other such interfaces. In an economy where we simply can't do that all by hand and personally all the time. So that's my optimistic response. Carl.
Yeah, and optimistically, I agree with what Ben said. For the advancements in terms of, say, care for people, it's important. One example I have, let's say personally, is my father-in-law. He wanted a security camera, installed it, put it at the front door. The neighbor's car in the driveway keeps triggering the pictures. There is no ML in that because I got thousands of photos that keep sending them. But definitely with machine learning, I can download Splunk or maybe an API that I can then do a zoning and say, okay, this zone here, don't worry about it. That's a basic, like very basic example, but the whole purpose is that there's a lot of positives. On the flip side, and again, as optimistic as we can be, we know no matter what, the security. So for example, a lot of the products now coming out of the marketplace, you see it. There's definitely AI needed to combat the amount of threats that are happening, right? So the bad actors, they're getting just as more sophisticated. Fraud online, right? Is it really a human, or is it actually someone trying to defraud someone? So I'm optimistic on one part to say for the advancements of the better society, and I'm optimistic that we got to maintain strong AI for protecting ourselves from, again, the opportunistic bad actors that will always be there, right? So there's that balance. So on one part, if we don't advance on one part, then you don't really benefit being able to protect yourself, right? So not to say, again, optimistic, but it's because we got to be really good at what we're doing as a society to make sure that people are protected in that.
Yeah.
Good time. What's your strategies for tackling technical debt with internal IT? So as things get more complex and more distributed, you have shadow IT. And do you have any specific strategies for keeping that under wraps or beating it back wherever you can?
So the question is strategy for handling technical debt. Let's start with Carl.
Yes, so no matter what, you got to operate your core. So whether you're running IT or you're a customer, your provider, your core is your core, and you cannot take a chance to make sure that's solid. But at the same time, you want to change to go forward. My view with systems is you always want to look at the optimization effect. That is, if you're going to move forward, you got to project out to say, here's why I'm going to be either modernizing, transforming, but then just like the old model is, you got to then decommission, deconstruct, because otherwise, to your point, you got like this graveyard of servers, VMs, data. You can't have a clean future if you're really bringing all this along. And it goes one-on-one with skills. It's the same thing. You want to still make sure your prize developers, your people are taken care of, but at the same time, you got to reskill to get there. So it's a very tough thing to do. But I think in the model, again, is you really got to make sure your house today's in order, but the house in the future, find a way to build it, and then again, just restructure, and that's how I would say.
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, I think it's also very contextual, right? It depends on your organization and what the nature of that technical debt is. I have colleagues who are in government agencies that have massive COBOL implementations, and they're not going to get away from that technical debt very quickly. And so, I think you wouldn't be surprised to hear me say bimodal is, a useful approach where you need to start developing parallel streams, parsing from the top down, potentially taking off user interfaces from old applications and then working your way through to key functionality. But again, I don't think there's a blanket formula. It depends on the nature of application, the nature of your business.
Yeah, so, I meant it individually for each of you. If it's not completely proprietary,
right?
Super interested in how you guys specifically tackle it for your use case.
There we go. Be happy to chat about that more after the event. Yeah.
And speaking of which, we have about 5 minutes left. So if there's any other questions from the audience, now would be a great time to. Yes, sir.
As startup founders, I just wanted to see what you think is your kind of biggest lessons learned along the way.
So as entrepreneurial CIOs, what are your biggest lessons learned along the way?
Well, that's an open-ended question, isn't it? I mean, a lot of it comes down to some of the stuff we've said already about, you know, industry expertise doesn't matter. I'm trying to think of which angle you're coming from. Though in starting a
just
business
from
and
a
running
business
it.
standpoint, or just an organization as a whole, 'cause, like the technology is always one aspect of the
Yeah.
whole organization.
So I'll give you one of my feelings is I think what's really critically important for a good CIO, and it's probably the same for a CTO and a CEO for that matter, is that you need to have a strong, well-articulated vision. It's really the only way to drive an organization forward. And it sounds very obvious, but it's amazing how many organizations or departments within organizations don't really have that. So if you're coming into an organization, and this goes a little bit to the technical debt question, if you're coming into an organization that needs a massive overhaul, you really need to provide a compelling vision that your team can get behind, because they're going to do all the heavy lifting. So you drive that with a vision that makes sense, that gives people purpose, and that is ultimately exciting. And that, to me, has been a recipe for success in a number of organizations that I've worked in.
It's easy for you to say your current founder invented the mobile internet. I mean, like, that's
Correct. You hit a clear vision.
Carl?
Yeah, I'm going to build from Ben's comment, which is exact. That is, you got to have that strong vision for your IT folks, and then as well with your executives. One of the challenges within anything, right, is sometimes an organization may say they want to go somewhere, and you walk in the room with the technology, but that can be the biggest risk, because the toughest part of strategy is your business has to really know where it wants to go, see the value where it's going to go, and once that's defined, so the business needs are very clear, yourselves as technologists, it's unlimited to solutions. So when you have defined requirement strategy from the business sense, then you can underlay a technology strategy for that. It doesn't mean you shouldn't bring the shiny toys in to say, here's something new, for example, machine learning and all that. But you got to be careful not to push technology where the business is being pushed by the technology and it hasn't really thought about what it's going to do with the technology. Because again, the whole part is really that balance of, you know, you want to share and show, but really define the business need in that, and then stuff.
Thank you. Last question from the audience. Yes, sir.
An industry that really cares about privacy is the healthcare industry, right? Like in healthcare, privacy is probably the holy grail, right? Now government's talking about privatizing healthcare, which sounds like an oxymoron, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can you privatize healthcare when in healthcare privacy is the most important thing, right? Now, if they go ahead with that, what would be some of the technical challenges?
So the primacy of privacy in particularly sensitive industries, how do you approach that on either side of the divide?
Now that's a great question, a really thorny question too. And happily, I'm not in the industry.
To me, it would sound like an
Yeah.
oxymoron, right? Because you're privatizing something that is where privacy is the most sacred.
Yeah. So let me draw a parallel at least to the conversation we had earlier about this, which is that, you know, there's a lot of paranoia about using cloud services for exactly this reason, right? Putting your data in the cloud, oh my God.
Yeah, it's open. Right?
Yeah, and yet governments are now starting to do exactly that. And they're doing that because, you know, at some point you have to recognize all of the benefits of doing that. I think we have a long way to go in terms of compliance and transparency and auditing in the cloud, and that's a big gap that we're continuing to look at, which is how do I audit my, you know, tens of cloud providers in an easy and simple way. But I think to a certain extent, you're going to have to take a leap of faith that the systems we have in place are doing their job from an audit perspective. So if you choose a vendor that claims to have all these certifications, you should exercise your rights to make sure that you have access to their SOX reports and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but the average patient, like an average patient going to emergency at a hospital,
Yeah.
he's not going to go.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Ben. In terms of how technology moves forward, any user of technology, anyone using it, or anyone providing it, has to ensure the security. That's the fundamental part of things. It's not for me to judge in terms of how the marketplace or how governments operate. The main thing is security is very important, and it's very important as well, again, that you look and you have transparency in that. But in my view, I think security is fundamental, but I can't really judge in terms of how you approach the marketplace or governments evolve technologies in that. For our organization, what I can say is that we have a very specific approach around how we handle privacy. We're under privacy laws. As an organization, we want to ensure, right, that the systems, the information is secure. And as Ben's saying, whatever we're doing in terms of using technology, we got to maintain that, right? And that's the important part for us as an organization.
I'd throw one more thing in there too, which is the slightly disingenuous notion that it's often felt that if we hold the data ourselves, it's safer, right? And yet the reality is that's just not clearly the case in many organizations. And so, you have to question the fundamental tenet there that it's going to be worse off if you privatize it than it is right now in a public sector institution. Who's got the better security model, better security procedures, who's got more security staff and whatnot. They're valid questions to ask, but I think starting out with the premise that introduces a new risk is a questionable tenet. And in fact, in the case of a lot of smaller and mid-sized organizations, you're often far better when you move to a bigger player because they simply have far more security staff and procedures and certifications. Right?
Last question.
I can just add on to that real quick. Do you think that's a spot where government needs to step in to, for example, make the PIDO or Privacy Act, or for example, GPDR more stringent to force these companies to self-regulate themselves or self-secure themselves?
So, in summary, do you think government needs to be doing more to step in certain breach circumstances?
Especially in, for example, healthcare.
Especially
God, yes. Yeah, that's a no-brainer. And we have a long way to go, but at least we're progressing on that front. And thankfully, GDPR pushed everybody forward, including Canada and PIPEDA. So it's promising, but it's a long way from where we need it to be.
Yeah, and I'd say with organizations, you have to look at privacy and security as being, you have metrics out there in industry. So a lot of times these metrics, for example, your security, your privacy incidents, those no matter what should drive how there's changes perhaps that need to occur, right? When you look in industry and you look at vendors out there in the social space, right, and you hear of how people's data is being leaked, or again people don't even realize what's happening. That's where in private sector there's a lot of things that need to occur when it comes to social media, perhaps. But at the same time, you want to allow vendors to operate. But you should have some type of regulations or some type of controls, again, just to ensure that the consumers understand, what's happening with their information.
So I just wanted to mention that with the Terminal Tech Talk series, our intention is to bring world-class speakers to you. We do these events monthly. They're free, and they happen all across Canada. That's part of the reason why we live stream these events. So that other offices and people all around the world can tune in to these conversations and be part of the conversation. So next month, we have a talk about leadership, decentralized teams, and moving at San Francisco speed. We're bringing in Andrew Collins, the CEO of Bungalow, as well as his Director of Engineering for a fireside chat to talk about how they've built the world's largest co-living company in a short period of time. And then following that, in June, we have a talk entitled Why GraphQL is the Future of APIs, which is going to be quite interesting if you're a developer, if you want to come out to that one. But if you can join me in thanking Carl and Ben for taking time out of the day, we'll stick around for a little bit longer. Just before you go, I was assured that these are two very, very special bottles in there, and you also have some terminal swag. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us.
Thank you very much.
And on behalf of the community and the Toronto office, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That's a wrap. One is a bottle specifically for the Toronto FC victory the other year. It's by a California winery. It's a really special bottle. It's a collector's piece. The other one is this incredible Chilean wine that's from the vintages section. So
Fantastic.
yeah,
That's a
from what I
classic
understand,
gift.
it's supposed to be really
That's a
good.
classic gift.
And then there's some. So no, thank you for coming. I can't thank you. But there's probably some people that want to say hi.
I do.
Hey, kill it.
This is gonna be one of the best talks I've ever been to.